here we are live. So welcome everyone. We are here today to introduce our new initiative, APIM Hotrod, or if you prefer, APIM Hotrod. But first, let's introduce ourselves, a sort of informal or formal introduction. I am Massimo Crippa. I'm working as lead architect at Codit in Belgium, and I'm passionate about cloud technology, cloud native technology in general. I work a lot with Azure API management, which is the star of this show. And they say I'm working with Microsoft technology, not only Azure, of course, since 20 years. And I'm co-hosting this hopefully nice show, together with Stephane Heiskens. Stephane, how are you?
Great, I'm fine, Massimo. So I'm very happy to be in the show, this new show. So I will also then introduce myself. So I'm Stefan. I'm also, let's say, doing cloud architecture for quite a while, and also passionate about technology in general. And so API management is also one of my first-class citizen, let's say, component in many architectures. So very happy to discuss and share some anecdotes about it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, and the main question is like, what are we going to talk about in this show?
You will tell us, right?
Yeah,
So
that's the main question, right?
yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So, yeah, for my point of view, so the idea here is like we said this year, API management is turning 10 years old. So it's been GA in 2014. So we had this idea, Stefan and myself, to talk about API management, but bringing some lessons learned from the field, some anecdotes about things that we saw, right?
Yeah, indeed. No, I think it's indeed. APIM was also one of the first services indeed I started to work with. I think when I started Azure, we had storage accounts, we had service bus, and we already had API management, or let's say 10 years ago. So it's not really at the start, but soon after the start, let's say. And indeed, so the service has changed drastically since of course, since the early days. So I think we will have a lot of things to share about it.
I remember that
Yeah.
it was launched, I think it was October, I have to check, or September in 2014, something like this, and just GA. And the year before, 2013, was bought from a company called Epiphany. And then I remember in October, November, I met in Paris with one of the founders of this Epiphany to start a partner program. Then together with Microsoft, then it took, let's say, 1 year of playing, service evolving, etc. And then I believe it was end of 2015 or somewhere in 2016, we got the first customer, the first project, and you get really the experience when you go in production, right? That's where
Yeah,
you really have
that's
the
true. Yeah,
return from the.
yeah, and that's true for every service. But indeed, return from the field, I think that's what we can share here, and indeed, that's for me what is really valuable. Is of course once you go to production with something, then you have to tackle everything you might encounter along the way. So yeah,
Okay, I have another question just to set the scene.
yeah.
How are we going to organize our episodes?
Well, I guess that we might use a map that I actually basically crafted recently. So maybe some people already know that I build some maps from time to time, and so I recently created a new map on APIM. And the goal of these maps is typically to try to see, okay, what are the different domains that you have to basically deal with when you onboard either on Azure itself or networking or whatever topic it might be. And so for APIM, basically I did the same. And so maybe Massimo, if you want to walk us through a little bit the most important areas, and I think that's what we're gonna talk about basically during the episodes.
Yeah.
But
So here we have your wonderful map. And by the way, Stefan, some last year or sometimes ago, he wrote a wonderful book, the Azure Cloud Native Architecture Map book. I have it here on my left. I love it. So, and where there are all these nice maps to explore the Azure landscape per se. But here, let's look at this map that Stephane recently did, and you can see is updated on February 2024. So this, yeah, right now.
Yeah, yeah,
So
recent.
there are different domains, as Stefan was saying, security, the design. There is this kind of grouping, and then you can have the part of, as I was saying, design, where you have common patterns. You can see it's breakdown on different subdomains. The example all about developing. When you then package and when you surface an API using productization, you have all the part of publishing, scale, and monitoring, and so on. So the idea is to bring together with Stefan some anecdotes from the real life and grouping our episode per those macro, let's say, cluster. So today maybe we could talk about some anecdotes about networking, for example, here
Yeah,
in the security
indeed.
part.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Yeah, so I think it's indeed a good recap of our intention. And basically here, yeah, this map, of course, is all the concerns you might have to tackle with APIM. So try to be quite comprehensive. But of course, you need to dig deeper on your own, right? The map is just like a bit a compass, right? To try to find your way to something. And like, okay, how can I secure, for instance, my API management instance? One of the ways to secure it is, for instance, of course, to use network, as you know, it's a security boundary that you use for almost every service now, especially nowadays. I suppose that Massimo, you also could see over the years the let's say the importance of network in let's say many Azure architectures. So back in the days where it was really public path everywhere, was less important. Now, even with public paths, we tend to use private link. We tend to basically try to isolate all path services from internet, basically, especially, and to master, let's say, the channels through which internet traffic is flying. So in APIM, of course, it makes no exception, but APIM is not so easy from a network perspective. So I tried actually in that map to show a little bit what we have today, and I'll try to follow up on this because we can expect there are some moving parts, but we can see that, of course, if you want to isolate, let's say, API management from internet, but there are multiple ways to isolate it. Of course, the inbound connectivity, right? So that's, for instance, something you can have fully with the premium tier or the dev tier. That's typically even one of the top reasons why customers were going to premium, basically to make sure that they could have a full VNet integrations for both inbound and outbound. But know that you have also the STV2 flavors, standard V2 and not STV2, sorry, the two new pricing tiers, so standard V2 and basic V2. You have alternatives as well, right? So, but the thing is that today it's not so easy. So if you really want to have a full isolation from internet and at the same time be able to talk to private backends, which is the ultimate goal, of course, then you would still go to premium today. But so that's a bit to show you the different options we have, and that will is likely to change probably in the future. So we need to closely follow up on that. Um, yeah, and so of course, when we choose to isolate APIM from internet, well, typically, of course, we also want to isolate the backends that API management is talking to, right? So if you have app service, AKS, whatever your backend services, wherever your backend services are hosted, you will also, of course, isolate them from internet so that you know you can control, let's say, how the traffic flies from the external world to your backend service ultimately. And so maybe I can indeed share an anecdote for this one. I will cover more broadly, let's say, network in maybe a dedicated episode. But maybe I can share the. You can see maybe on the map the DIP and VIP. Maybe Massimo, I don't know if you see it. It's
Yeah,
a bit.
it's
It's
here.
this one. Yeah. Yeah, I know, but these are the VIP. So a VIP is of course a static IP, so it's a virtual IP that is not changing, right? And so yeah, so it's a bit above Massimo. If we take backend ACLs, right, where we have how can we protect or restrict our backends to be called only by API management, because that's typically also something you try to do. Then you have to see actually which IP the backend will see. And the thing is that you have the concept in API management of VIP, so virtual IP, so which is static, that normally never changes unless you would, of course, switch out the APIM instance from one VNet to another. And then you have the concept of a dip, and I think that's not so well known, but that's quite important. And the dip is then a dynamic IP. So if you, for instance, take, maybe I can go onto Visio. I think we have
Yeah.
screen ready. I think it's going to be just easier to explain this. So I really start from something, blank, and I will even not use Azure icons. That's not required for this. Um, yeah, Visio, please go a bit faster. Yeah, that's good. So let's say this is my APIM. So let's forget about, let's say, the incoming traffic from internet. Just want to focus, let's say, on APIM and the backend, right? Backend services. And that could be whatever. So it could be app services, it could be AKS, container apps, let's say whatever backend we have. We typically want, of course, to isolate API management from internet, and that's typically by taking a premium, let's say, tier in internal mode, VNet internal mode, but you also want to make sure that your backend services, at least your APIs, are only called by APIM. And so for this, you would use, let's say, network controls as well. And here, the concept of VIP or DIP is quite important, because if you have APIM, let's say, in internal modes, I will maybe just, sorry, it's here. So let's say we have a subnet then here, right? So we'll have a VNet and APIM will have a subnet. And so, of course, that subnet will have a range. So let's say it's whatever, just to say something, it would be this range. So that would be where the gateway is actually running. So if you have a private backend and you want to make sure that APIM, let's say, is the only one that can call you, then you would typically do an IP restriction. So if it's, let's say, app service, could be IP restrictions, or it could be just NSGs, right? So if your app services are, let's say, hosted on an app service environment, or let's say using private endpoint and so on, you might just also use an NSG, right? And then whitelist only the APIM range, right? Subnet range. That would be a way to restrict access. And so why should you use the range? Well, because actually the gateway, so if APIM is in internal mode and is talking to a backend service, then the IP that will be seen by the backend service will be an IP from that range, but it's going to be a dynamic IP. So it's not a VIP in this case, it's a dynamic IP. So if you would, let's say, if you try it out and you have the first IP would be 4, well, if you just say this one can only be called by number 4, then maybe next time it will be number 5, you see? So you'd better really, let's say, whitelist the entire range. But that's also, if you get this point, it also means that you should never mix or have multiple instances of APIM in the same subnet. Because if you do that, so I had, and that's the anecdote, I had once worked for a customer where they actually mixed together, let's say, non-production instances in one subnet and production instances in another subnet. But then they were not able anymore to distinguish if that was the dev APIM talking, let's say, to a dev backend, or a test APIM talking to a test backend. And that's because indeed they were, just picking up an IP from that subnet. And since both instances were in that subnet, then of course you could not identify to restrict, for instance, dev to dev and test to test. See, so that's important. Massimo, if there is anything that's not clear, feel free to intervene or
Yeah,
to
I would say here that the lessons learned is one subnet per API management
indeed.
instance.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. But then you might also, maybe you have noticed, and yeah, for sure you have noticed, Massimo, but maybe our, let's say, attendees might have noticed as well, that even if you have APIM in internal mode, so fully VNet integrated, you still have a public VIP, right? So let's say here it's APIM internal mode, and so you will still have a public VIP. So let's say maybe IP still, to use not only rectangles. Let's say I have a public IP here, and that's going to be public. But you might say, okay, but then why do you have a public IP when we are fully VNet integrated? Might say it's actually useless, and actually it's still in use. It's still used, sorry, by APIM for outbound traffic. So here, if I take my APIM internal mode talking to my private backend, then it's not going to be used. It's going to take a dip. But if my APIM, say that I have a policy in my APIM that has a send request, let's say I'm using a send request policy to go to Google, right? So then it would be, let's say it's a Google, we don't care too much about the icon, then it will use this IP to go to Google, right? And so that's why, and so where for Google you don't care too much, but it could still make sense if you have like B2B business, right? So if, for instance, you are from APIM consuming an API from another API that's not your API, right, from a partner, if that partner wants to restrict his API to your, IP, then this is the IP you would have to give, right? Because then this is what APIM will use. It will use its own VIP, let's say, to connect to internet-facing
And,
backend. So, yeah,
and I have
Massimo.
something interesting in this, or I might have something interesting. So
Yeah,
up to you to tell me if I'm right or not. So I thought till today this VIP, that public virtual IP, is assigned by the platform, right?
yeah,
So it
yeah.
cannot be changed. But now, since few months, there is a possibility to assign that static IP. So by moving to the STV2 platform,
Yeah,
now it's
indeed.
possible when you create, when you define, when you associate your subnet, your network
Yeah,
to your API management service, you can specify a static public IP, and that would be your public IP. So you are in control upfront
yeah, of the IP. Yeah,
of the value that will be used as a public VIP. That's
yeah.
interesting, right?
It's interesting indeed because, of course, IPs, network still plays an important role, especially nowadays. I mean, in Azure as well. So all PaaS services have different flavors to try to isolate from internet or at least have IP restrictions and that kind of stuff. So you need indeed to be in control of the IPs and know which IP is used for what. But just one thing still that I want to add. So that is the default behavior here, right? So if you don't use, let's say, any specific routing, so that's the default behavior of APIM. So if you talk, let's say, to an inside backend, an internal backend, it will use a DIP. If you talk to internet, it will use its VIP. In this case, that will be the outbound VIP. But it could also be something different. And that's where it can get even more interesting. So now even Azure has some legacy stuff. And Massimo, you are long enough in Azure to probably see as well some legacy environment at customer side. And basically, say that my backend is an app service, right? But my app service is still internet facing, right? So like it's not you, I don't use private link, so private endpoints and so on. And it's an internet facing, let's say, service. And also I would put it here next to Google because it's internet. And I have an IP restriction here, right? So I might be tempted to say, okay, and that could work depending on your setup. I might be tempted to say, okay, I will put an IP restriction here and that I will whitelist this IP, right? Because I know that's what APIM is using, which is true by default. But if, let's say, you have enabled what is called service endpoints back in the days, then actually, instead of seeing the VIP, although you are internet facing, you will see the DIP because that's the effect of the service endpoint for instance, the Microsoft.web. You see, so you might actually have this, and you might have even two other options. Sorry, guys, I know it starts to become complex, but that's always the case with Azure networking. So say that you have yet another app service, let's say 1, 2, it's just to illustrate, and this one is also internet facing, but basically I explicitly define a route, right? A route table here. So let's say on my subnet, and I say, for instance, I have a route that says 00, a default route that says, okay, everything that is going to internet, send this to an NVA, right? NVA, so Network Virtual Appliance or Azure Firewall, whatever. Then, of course, the IP that the backend will see is the one public IP of the firewall. You see, so basically, the default behavior will be that APIM will use its outbound VIP, but if you, of course, force routing to say no, everything that is going to internet is actually has to go through a firewall, then of course it's the firewall IP that you would see. And if it's a private backend, in theory, you would anyway let it go this way, right? Unless, of course, the backend would be in another data center, which is always possible, and unless you would also enforce another route for private traffic. Yeah? But let's say that is less common. Let's say if the backend is close to APIM, then it would just go the VNet route way, let's say, through the virtual network. Yeah, so you see, I think it was interesting to add this. And so lessons learned, as you highlighted, Massimo. So we should never mix different APIMs in the same subnet. That's for sure, right? Unless there would be different APIMs from the same environment. So like 2 instances in dev, even then you could not identify which one. But it might be less of a problem, of course, if at least you can identify the environment. And then for outbound traffic, but it's not that simple. So really to know what IP will a given backend see. If it's, let's say, an internal backend, it should always be a DIP, so one of the IPs of that subnet, and again, just whitelist the entire subnet. And if it's, let's say, an internet-facing backend, it could see a firewall IP, it could see APIM's outbound IP, or it could see, let's say, another DIP if service endpoint was enabled for, let's say, that specific backend type. So that's a bit anecdote. Was really I started to really get interested in this from that real world example where they mixed different let's say APIM instances in the same subnet. And so I said, okay, now it's gonna be hard to to see. And there is a last use case I forgot. You could
Go
also
ahead. Go
use a
ahead.
NAT gateway. You could also use a NAT gateway in the subnet. If you say use a NAT gateway, then that could also be one of the IPs of that is associated to that gateway. So you see, that's a fourth option, I would say. So could be basically, to make it more clear, that would be a NAT gateway IP that this backend would see, right? NAT gateway, that could be firewall IP that it would see, and then the last one would be basically the outbound, or the public VIP, let's say, that is used for outbound traffic. Yeah, these are the three options. And no, the fourth option was then the DIP. You see, so if you have
Yeah.
service endpoints, then you have then the DIP, right?
And
So
of
DIP
course, that
is
depends
service
on the tier that you are using, right? So
of
that
course.
firewall
Yeah.
IP, that net gateway can only come with network integration, of course, right?
Indeed, and that's indeed very important. That's indeed good to highlight, because that is true, of course, for premium and let's say for APIM, where outbound traffic is VNet integrated. And let's actually summarize it this way, because of course, if you have like I don't know, a basic APIM where you have, let's say, the serverless one, that's a nice example that does not integrate at all with VNet. Then of course, with that one, you would only see let's say an APIM managed public IP, but you would not see anything else, because it's not VNet integrated, so you would not be able to route traffic your way and so on. So indeed, but yeah, you see, just APIM, just one specific topic, and
Yeah,
already.
but that's the goal of this little show here, to just give this all of these nice learning from this field, share this experience with experiences with the community out there. So I think it was really great to warm up the engine of our hot rod here, huh?
Yeah,
And
indeed.
it was a nice one to start sharing with this
Yeah,
first
I
episode.
think it was indeed not too bad. Maybe not the easiest one to
Yes,
start
of
with,
course,
but
sure.
anyway,
But as you said, Stefan, these days, so almost everything is network integrated. So it's
yeah,
this network isolation came back as an extremely important requirement, especially from enterprises, right?
yeah,
So
indeed. No, indeed.
it's a
So
daily stuff. Mm.
yeah, indeed. No, really important. So
Okay,
good. Yeah,
I will say that we are good for this first episode. I thank you, Stefan, and everyone that will watch this one, and stay tuned for more. I would say.
yeah. Thank you, Massimo. And then yeah, let's eager to looking forward for the second episode. Yeah, or the first really topic centered episode. Yeah.
Future
See you,
will tell.
Massimo. Yeah, indeed. Thank you. See you. Bye.